Okay. Now, values is probably one of the areas that most people have trouble with because they are so arbitrary, or can be arbitrary. But they're basically, we're talking about the steps of gray between black and white. This is a typical artist grayscale. This is a color breakdown of light to dark. And of course, some colors just simply never get to black unless you add a dark, either a complementary dark color or black to make them dark. So, but this shows you the steps, and the most valuable thing you can do is learn how to judge values and be able to look at a color and say that is like a 60% gray, or that's a 20% gray. Is being able to transpose colors to the grayscale will help you tremendously. This is a little more extended one with 20 steps of gray. And let me just mention here, to give you an idea of just how important the sensitivity is to this. This is about 20 steps. TV, at least the old CRT screens, had about 50 steps of gray they could register, okay? That's as sensitive as they could be. And then prints, photographic prints, can do about 100 to 150 steps of gray, the sensitivity that they can actually register. Slides will go to 200, 250 steps of gray. The film is sensitive enough to discreetly record those steps of gray. And that's why when you take a picture of something and you see the dark shadows in the picture, it's just black. It's because it just can't see all those very subtle differences in values. The human eye can register 100,000 steps from white to black. That's how sensitive our eyes are. It gives you an idea of how important values are to our eyes. The irony, of course, is the job of the artist is to knock down those 100,000 steps of gray down to 5 or 6 steps in a painting. That's part of our job, is we edit out. But we also are able to see all those little details in the shadows and so forth. And that's why you need to learn to paint outdoors and not always from a photograph. A photograph has so little information compared to what's outdoors. So I really push, I'm going to skip through this. I really push learning to use the grayscale and painting in plein air, because if you paint only from photographs, the photographs are very high contrast because they only have so many steps of gray they can record or color. And so if that's all you ever paint, your paintings tend to become harsh and kind of hard because they don't see the subtleties. Now, if you paint outdoors and then you come back and you paint in your studio, at least you will have a little bit more of that sensitivity for those subtleties. Because for one thing, you've seen them outside, you've studied them for hours, and when you paint from your photograph that you took outdoors, you'll be able to interpret it much better. So again, I push plein air painting for that reason. We talked about that. One thing that's important is because it's the handling of the values that determine the power of the painting, particularly the darks. And they are also where you create your abstract design for your painting. The basic darks and secondary darks create a design, and that's your abstraction of your painting. And all good representational paintings are built on good abstract design. Okay, abstract design is very important. I don't think of it pretty much as an end in itself. I don't care for abstract painting as such, particularly. I feel it's very limited. It gets boring very quickly. But abstract design is essential for good representational painting. Squinting is where you break down, you squint, and you see fewer and fewer values when you squint, and it helps you to learn to mask or map your values in a scene. We'll talk about that later. Ideally, your values in the early stages of your painting, you want to cut it down to 3, maximum 5 values. And you want to think in terms of the 80% rule. And the 80% rule is basically that 80% of your darks should be touching. It should be touching. It should be overlapping. 80% of them. And let's put it this way. The closer you get to the 80%, the more powerful your painting is going to be. the more unified it's going to be, and the simpler it's going to be. And I'll show you an example of that here in a minute. And it goes the other way too. If you get 80% of your lights, your lightest lights, touching, that is even better, okay? So here is a painting. And so if I break down and just show the in gray, you can sometimes see the darks and the lights better. You can see how all those darks are actually, they're touching. You can find a way, if they were volume instead of paint, you could pour water in it, it would fill it all up. Here it's even more contrast. When you create a dark contrast or a high contrast, you can see how all the darks and secondary darks are touching. Here's another example. And you should be able to see it here, but if I knock it down to gray and high contrast it, look how, you go through here and virtually 100% of the darks are touching in that painting. There is no place that you can't get from here to there if you follow the path, okay? And even around, even through here. What you want to do, what this does is it creates eye paths for your eye, and your eye doesn't stumble over things, and it unifies the whole picture. This is the abstract design of the picture, okay? This is where it's got to work. And the rest of it is just filling in the numbers with color in one sense. Okay, in terms of values. There's a 50% value there against the light blue sky. Same 50% value, no change whatsoever. You notice the difference? Does that look lighter than that value? They're both 50%, but because this is surrounded by dark and that's surrounded by light, it affects the value. That's why values are so difficult to judge, because they're affected by what's around them. So that's one of the things you have to learn. That's why using a grayscale, particularly with working from photographs, is very helpful. And just in terms of seeing how the 50% varies as we go through the painting. Okay. Now, the way you want to see an image, whether it's outdoors or from a photograph, the first thing you want to see is your darkest darks. See, those are my darks. And then my secondary darks. And then more or less my middle tones. And then I get into the lights, and then even lighter, my primary lights. So this is the way you want to see the image. This is what you want to paint. You want to think of the image in front of you as if you could cut out construction paper, black and white or black and gray construction paper, and just lay it flat, that's what you want to see. It's so much easier to paint that than to paint that. You don't start out painting that, you start out painting that. And you've got to see it in order to paint it. So just to show you real quickly this image, this idea about the relativity of value. Here's a 100% black background, ideally, with this relatively white spot. And look what happens as the background changes. And this is 70% background, 60%, 50%, 40, 30%. The dot's gone. It's because that dot was a 30% gray, okay? Now what happens when the background lightens up? That's the same exact dot. And even if you intellectually know it, it's an optical illusion you cannot control. I don't care how good an artist you are, it doesn't change it. You're just as susceptible to optical illusions as anybody else, but you have to know to look for it. So for example, I move that over. Those are two the same exact color. But if you were painting a scene and there was some subject matter over here, this value, and in the same value was over here, your tendency, if you didn't really look at it and didn't use your grayscale, your tendency would be to paint this lighter or paint this darker than that. And then it wouldn't work and you'd think, why isn't it working? Why does this look so harsh and too light? It's because your eyes were fooled by this relative values based upon what's around it. So you got to be conscious of that. And use your grayscale, and because very often you'll see that somebody will paint flowers way too light because they misjudge the background. And here's an example. I won't go through everything here, but this area up here, that area there, this area here, and the edge of the sphere are all exactly the same value in every one of these 4 pictures. But look at the difference over here. They look much brighter, don't they? Now, even though they're actually exactly the same, what's around them affects how you interpret them. And why this is important is a lot of times you're painting, let's say you paint the flowers, the yellow flowers, and they just aren't bright enough. But if you add more white to the flowers, what happens to it? The flowers get pastel-y, you get pale, okay? But you want that real rich, intense yellow. But when you do that, it just doesn't look bright enough. So what do? You darken everything around it, okay? So you can control your values that way. If it's not light enough, but you can't go any lighter, or for example, you've got red, you start adding yellow to it, it gets pink. You start adding, white to it, it gets pink. You start adding yellow, it's okay, but then pretty soon it gets to be orangey. But you want that bright red, but it's just not strong enough. Darken everything around it, okay? And then it will pop out as bright. It'll look brighter. Okay, that's if you do nothing else, you learn this. That'll be very helpful information. Now, shapes. Shapes, we know what those are. I'm not going to go into that, but they simplify and organize the painting, and you want to preferably break up the shapes and paint everything flat, undimensional first, and then later create 3 dimensions by modeling. Don't try to start modeling the shapes. Create them first, preferably no more than 6 shapes, and try to make your shapes interlocking like a jigsaw puzzle, not boring and just the same shape over and over. Be very careful about puffy clouds and bushes are all the same shape. Here's a bunch of shapes in here. Every one of these balloons, even though they're all round, there's not one of them that's identical to the other. And as soon as I would start painting them where they were the same, it would get very boring very quickly. Same thing here. There's not one rock in here that's the same shape as another rock. It's very tempting to start painting. All of a sudden, you're painting every rock the same shape, even the same size. So you got to be conscious of your shapes in that regard. And break down initially 3 to 5 values, no more than 6 shapes. Let me show you that. Go back to our beautiful Taos scene here. If you haven't been to Taos, boy, this is what it looks like right now, okay? Fields of gold, just like that. This is in residential Taos. Ooh, okay. We've seen this, right? There's how many shapes? 1, 2, 3, count all that there. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7 or 8 shapes at least. See, that's a little too many. Just look what happens when I take away 2 shapes. Look how much more powerful that image is. Isn't that a more pleasing image than this image here with all this stuff going on? But I take away a few shapes and bam, it becomes a much more powerful design. Edges, here's a flat edge, a line, just a flat line. Look what happens to the same exact shape, but it made it being edges where they're basically what are called hard edges and soft or lost edges. Found edges, lost edges, found edges, lost edges. You can see a 3-dimensional quality to that, but that you don't see here. This looks flat, this looks 3-dimensional. Just by controlling the edges, you create 3 dimensions. Lost and found, hard found edges bring things forward, soft edges push them back. Here's an example here. See this right here? Now I look at that and I say, oh, that's a soft edge, but actually that's a very hard edge. Because a hard edge is where no matter how much you squint, you can still see a definite line between the 2 values. No matter how much you squint, you're going to see a separation between this white and that dark background on that powdered, on that fox there. And so that's a hard edge, but it's got a soft feathered texture to it, but it's still hard. Here's a soft edge. See how that shoulder almost disappears? You squint a little bit and it starts disappearing. You see these other areas where you squint some and you just don't see them anymore. Those are soft or lost edges. They create a shape in modeling. This comes towards me. That shoulder's coming towards me. This shoulder's going back. It is actually doing that not only in the drawing, but I'm accentuating it by creating a soft edge. If I create a hard edge here, had a spotlight on that, it would bring it forward and it would take away some of the three-dimensional qualities. Here's just one more example of that. Whenever I'm working, whether it's in landscape or portraiture, I try to create a soft edge, hard edge, soft edge. In my mind, I'll be saying, okay, a hard edge, soft edge, hard edge. So I'll go, hard edge, soft, lost, soft, hard, soft, soft edge. Lost, the hair is virtually lost there. It's picked up, found, lost there, found. You just go all the way around there, lost, found, lost, found, lost, found. And that creates a modeling effect that creates three-dimensional quality, and it goes for the inside as well as the periphery. And it creates the whole idea of atmosphere. Your edges are very important in creating atmosphere. See, totally lost edge, hard edge, found edge, lost edge, creates this almost a movement that creates roundness. And it's what you consider at the end of the painting primarily. You don't worry too much about your edges. It's when you're finishing off, the last consideration is edges. That's the last thing. Edges are what determines the finish of a painting. So if I'm painting, any point I want to finish it, if I just fix my edges, it's finished. The values, everything else can be somewhat not complete, but if I fix my edges, it will look complete. And I'll give you an example of that. I was doing a portrait for a group, and I had 2 hours to do the portrait from life. And something happened, I can't even remember what it was, but it was cut short in about 30 minutes. They said, you got to wind it up. Something was happening. I forget what it was. And it had about 30 or 40 minutes to do the painting. And so they said, okay, you got about 10 minutes. I stopped whatever else I was doing and I just fixed edges. And this was the sample, this was that painting. If you look, this is the green background. It's just all like transparent through him. You can see it everywhere because I just didn't put much paint down. This is a pastel. All I did was make sure the edges were right, and it looks finished. Even though I didn't put much, this is all the paint I put on that hat. It's just a few little strokes, a little bit here. But because the edges were finished where they were important, it gives it a finished look. So the answer, if someone asks you, how do you know when a painting's done? It's when the edges are finished, whatever stage you're at.